Hey guys, so I hope you've all gotten a chance to look at Mark chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. At least maybe read the verses, even if you haven't gotten to answer any of the questions yet. But I want to talk a little bit about John the Baptist and especially about how these verses relate to the Old Testament. And maybe that'll help you with some of the questions that I sent out to you guys also. So at the beginning of these verses, in verse 2, it says, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. And it's really a combination of a couple of different prophecies from the Old Testament, Isaiah being one of those. But the first prophecy is from Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, which says, "Behold, I'm sending my messenger before you who will prepare your way." And if you guys want to look at that for context, but I just want to tell you the point of it is that God is about to come to Israel and come with judgment and with salvation, judging those who are not faithful and saving those who are faithful. And he prophesies that before he comes in judgment and salvation on the day of the Lord, he's going to send a messenger ahead of him. The second quotation, which is in Mark 1:3, says, "A voice calling out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight." This is from Isaiah. It's Isaiah 40, verse 3. And both of these are prophecies about John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist would come before Jesus, before the Messiah would come. And notice in verse 3, it describes exactly what is said later in Mark, that whoever it was that would come before Jesus to prepare the way would live in the wilderness. He'd be calling out in the wilderness. So these are things showing that even from the Old Testament, God already had a plan for John the Baptist to come and to prepare the way for Jesus. But I also want to point out in both of these verses that he quotes from the Old Testament, both in Malachi and in Isaiah, both of them were talking about not preparing the way for a person, but preparing the way for God. Malachi 3:1 said, God says, "I'm coming to judge those who are unfaithful and save those who are faithful. And before I come, I'm going to send my messenger ahead of me." And then in Isaiah, it says that the voice calling out in the wilderness will say, "Prepare the way of the Lord." So these Old Testament prophecies were about preparing the way for God. But Jesus is God. This is one way that the Gospel of Mark shows that Jesus is God. But I want to point out some things that maybe are not as obvious in here. And that is how John the Baptist relates to Elijah. So that quotation from Malachi 3:1 that prophesies that someone is coming before Jesus comes to prepare the way for him. If you go to the next chapter, Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 through 6, it says that the messenger that he's going to send before the day of the Lord is Elijah. Now, if you guys think through the New Testament, Elijah didn't show up very much. Just on the Mount of Transfiguration, that's it. But still, it says that Elijah would come before him. The disciples asked Jesus about this. They said, "Why do all of the religious scholars say that Elijah comes before the Messiah?" And Jesus said, "Well, Elijah has come. It was John the Baptist. They just didn't accept him as the Elijah was to come." So this prophecy in Malachi is really a symbolic prophecy, that it wasn't Elijah himself who was coming. Rather, it was someone who came as a prophet like Elijah was to the people of God. A couple of other details that show that John is the fulfillment of this prophecy about Elijah. In Mark 1:5, it talks about him baptizing in Jordan. This is a small detail, but that's the exact region that Elijah did his ministry. The Old Testament says that he was living out in the wilderness like John, that he was living there around the Jordan River. But especially verse 6, which I hope you guys have had a chance to read verse 6 at least. Mark 1:6 says, "John wore clothes of camel hair and a leather belt around his waist and ate locusts and wild honey." In other words, he ate wild honey and grasshoppers. But the clothes that he wore in the Old Testament, when it describes Elijah, it describes his clothes as well. And it says that he wore clothes made out of animal hair and he wore a leather belt around his waist. The exact same description as John the Baptist. The reason I think it's significant to see how the Old Testament really prophesied even the details about John the Baptist and how he was coming before Jesus. The reason I think that's important is to remember that God knows the details of the future, which means He also knows the details of your future. I think this is helpful for us to see that all that God has promised us for the future, He's able to fulfill all of those things, and that's just one more reason for us to have faith in Him and trust in what God's outcome is for our life.